all here for having me. So, like you mentioned, today I will be talking about some exploratory mixed methods research that I conducted summer 2022 in various cities in the South. And the title of this talk is Too Hot, Too Cold to Go. I love the title. Climate change through the eyes of Black baby boomers in the American South. And so I want to thank Boston College because they funded this research for us to be able to travel around the South and talk to people, which is something I love to do. So I want to acknowledge BC. And I also want to acknowledge the Black women and femmes whose work and scholarship and activism inspires my work and also inspires my affinity towards understanding, examining, and reducing inequality. And so this research that I talk about in my research agenda broadly focuses on the intersection of inequality and environment, right? And so the main question that kind of undergirds all of my research is how do systems of oppression like racism impact and shape the built-in natural environment in ways that not only shape our relation to the environment, but also our ability. And so, as I mentioned, across summer 2022, I was able to visit 3 different urban cities in the U.S. South, and I okay, that works. So yes, I did 67 semi-structured interviews, in-depth interviews with individuals across 3 cities in the urban South: Jackson, Mississippi, my hometown, Nashville, Tennessee, and New Orleans, Louisiana. And so each of these cities in the South have unique environmental and racial histories, and also currently very unique economic trajectories. And I'm going to try to pivot to these and get back to the main presentation. Right, so here is Nashville, and so as you can see, these are just some screenshots of different environmental justice issues, economic issues, racial tensions around environmental justice issues currently, or more recently in Nashville, Tennessee. Nashville, Tennessee, and the historically Black community in Nashville, Tennessee has histories of things like displacement, things like universities, and eminent domain displacing whole communities. I don't know if anyone has ever been to Nashville. Raise your hand if you've been to Nashville. Okay, so very good university, my alma mater. As great as it is, using eminent domain, essentially with its hospitals and medical schools and other schools, completely displaced a Black community. If you've ever been to the Centennial Park, where the replica of the Centennial, that used to be a Black community. It's now Centennial Park and parts of very good campus. I also went to, again, my hometown. It's also always great when you can kind of double up your research and like go back home and visit your family. And so that's what I did here. If you have a computer or a TV, I'm sure you have seen some of the environmental justice issues in and around Jackson, particularly around access to water and the water crisis. At the time of the study, Jackson was in a water crisis, and then a few weeks after I left, there was flooding of the Pearl River, which made things even much more desperate and difficult. So there's infrastructural issues with the water systems, and then again, decades of what I view as environmental racism. And then the last site, New Orleans, Louisiana, great place to be, great place to live. I used to live south of New Orleans. Again, also, if you're familiar with environmental justice research, you're familiar with Cancer Alley, which is just south of New Orleans, where all of the oil factories and factories are sited near low-income and Black communities. And because of this, cancer rates in that part of Patagonian County are very low. So again, all these cities have histories of environmental justice issues, and again, different economic trajectories. Nashville is a growing city. Jackson, Mississippi, not so much. New Orleans is experiencing widespread gentrification and displacement of long-term residents. All right, so the sample for this study was Black baby boomers. It started with just Black baby boomers, but as I began to do interviews, I actually now have some silent generation individuals. I think the oldest person in my sample for this was 85, I believe. Right, and so I wanted to study Black baby boomers because if I'm thinking about climate change as an environmental justice issue and also a policy issue, we know that some of the extreme weather related to climate change impacts vulnerable populations, and that includes not only children, but older adults. In terms of climate change policy, we know that baby boomers are still the largest voting constituency in the US. And so although that is a fact, we don't know much about what older Black adults think about climate change, right? They're not necessarily included in mainstream discourse around climate change. Climate change is usually discussed and visible to usually whiter and younger generations, right? So I was really interested in their thoughts about that. And so the main research questions that guided this exploratory research were what attitudes and beliefs do older Black Americans hold regarding climate change? Where do older Black Americans receive information related to climate change? And then how does that impact their beliefs and prioritization of climate change policy in their voting behaviors? And then lastly, how do older Black Americans take care of their health and the health of future generations in relation to climate change? All right, so I'm going to run through the descriptive stuff really quickly. The goal was to do 25 interviews in each city. Based on the numbers, you can probably guess where I started and where I ended. I started with I started with Nashville, Tennessee, was able to complete 25 interviews, followed up in Jackson, was able to do 22. By the end of the summer, I was tired, it was hot. I was able to do 20 interviews in New Orleans. So the total sample was 67. In terms of age, participants ranged from age 57 to 87, and most of the participants were between the ages of 67 and 72. It was about split in terms of gender, a little more women than men in the sample, and in general, about a third had at least a high school diploma, but also another third had less than a high school diploma, and many of those had a middle school education. And then there were less than a third, but a good proportion of folks who had at least a bachelor's degree or a higher degree. As you probably would guess, most folks had been married at some point. So they were either currently married or divorced, separated, or widowed. That was well over 6% of the sample. Another third of the sample had never been married. And then again, you could probably guess, most folks were retired, either voluntarily or they had a disability or illness that made it impossible for them to work. We're involved with that. So most folks were Christian, and of those who were Christian, most were Baptist in terms of denomination. So that made up pretty much most of the sample. They were either Christian Baptist or another denomination. And in terms of political affiliation, also probably not surprising, most folks were Democrat. Most were voters or were registered voters. The few who were not registered voters were not registered because they had previously been incarcerated. Some of the participant men had been incarcerated. They were in their 60s and 70s that had been incarcerated against their 20s. So of course, didn't have the right to vote, so they weren't registered to vote. And then most folks were voted in at every level, so at the local, state, and national. And so to wrap up the descriptive stuff, before I got into the in-depth interviews, I wanted to just gauge their thoughts and ideas and knowledge around climate change. So I asked participants about why they thought the Earth was getting warmer. And you can see most people pointing to human activities such as burning fossil fuels as probably a likely cause of the Earth getting warmer. But others also pointed to thinking, the Earth is getting warmer because of just nature and natural reasons. And then a good portion of folks who were honest and said, you know what, I don't know. And then lastly, when asked about if there was evidence of climate change, or global warming, most people said that yes, there's at least some evidence of climate change and global warming. All right, just some differences between samples of the studies and other differences. People in Jackson had more people in Jackson identified as Democrats than folks in Nashville, who were there was a large number of Black individuals who identified as independents. In terms of gender differences, women relative to men usually had a more liberal political ideology, and then a large proportion of women than men were registered voters because of the reason I just pointed to. Most likely, more women than men reported that they thought climate change was due to natural changes in the environment rather than human activities. And then across education, folks with less than high school diploma relative to folks who are college graduates reported more liberal political ideology, which is a bit, might be a bit counterintuitive. And then more people with less than a high school diploma relative to folks who had some college or college graduates reported that they believed that climate change was due to natural changes rather than human activities. All right, let's get to the good stuff. The qualitative findings. And so these were some of the organizing themes based on the questions and the structure of the in-depth interview. And so I'm going to talk about some preliminary findings from the qualitative analysis. Not all of these, right? Very interesting stuff comes from a lot of these, but I'll only talk about a few. I will say, in terms of perceptions across perceptions of climate change across lifespan, that was very rich and proven information. I won't talk about it today, but essentially I asked individuals, think about when you were a child up until now. Do you think that, would you say that there's been a change in how hot the summer gets, or how cold the winters get, and how much it snows, or how much it rains, how much flooding exists? And the stories that came from those questions were not only varied, right? And included these major natural disasters in each city, right? But just really rich and interesting. But the thing I will focus on today will be environmental problems, like how when asked about the biggest environmental problem in the city, or in their community or neighborhood, the answers were very varied. Right, and so some folks pointed to more traditional environmental problems, so things like water, water systems. Other folks talk about the heat, and this is an issue across all three sites. That the heat is, you can't stand it. It's hard to go outside. Some people talk about the fact that in the news, they hear political pundits denying climate change and denying global warming, and when they step outside and they're like, how can you deny that? It's so hot outside, right? Other folks talk to environmental issues in a different way, right? The issue of gun violence or violence in the neighborhood actually came up across all three cities from some residents as the biggest environmental problem that they face, right? And so here we see things around water and about heat and about guns and violence, which is interesting because there is research, growing numbers of research that connects heat and gun violence, right? Or heat and, psychologically speaking, aggression and how that plays out in neighborhoods. On the other end, there's a growing number of research, there's growing research on green space and tree cover, and how that's related to violence in neighborhoods, and how in general we find that green space and tree cover not only mitigates heat, right? Mitigates the effect of urban heat islands, but it also has a calming and mood boosting benefit, right? And so all of these things are connected. In terms of the effects of climate change, there are some really interesting insights from individuals. And so in general, folks talked about the impacts of what they thought as climate change continues to get worse, what they thought the world might look like was very varied, right? So more disasters. People talk about, walking outside and having your skin cooked. Folks talk about sickness and more disease. Other folks talk about the possibility of the human race having to just leave the earth and, find another planet, right? And we've seen those sorts of things. If you're a sci-fi fan, like I am, you've seen those sorts of things, right? In the distant future, the earth is like a hot mess and you can't live there, it's not sustainable. And so now humankind either lives in ships in space or on another planet, right? And so a lot of the community members mention these things. The cause of climate change. I think this is one of my favorite parts of talking to people and walking through their thoughts around the causes of climate change. So a lot of folks pointed to some of the things that we kind of intuitively know about what might be causing climate change. So factories, pollution, cars, pesticides, again, pollution, oil drilling, things that are related to the ozone, us using so many cars. That was very, a lot of folks talk about these things, but a lot of folks also talk about, in terms of the cause of climate change, it being God's work, right? Some people framed it as a function of God punishing humankind just for, in general, sin in general. Other folks framed God being the cause of climate change as a function of mankind doing things that they shouldn't be doing. And by that, I mean space exploration. Across all three things, across education, gender, etc. Many folks pointed to space exploration as what they believe caused climate change in two ways. One way, more literally, so when rockets enter the atmosphere or leave the atmosphere, there's all sorts of pollution that comes from the rockets and, messing up the ozone, messing up the air, right? Which leads to, global warming and climate change, right? Other folks said, well, humans aren't supposed to fly, and humans definitely aren't supposed to leave the earth, right? That's not what God intended. And so the fact that humankind has found a way to leave the earth, God's upset, and he's punishing us because we're doing things we're not supposed to do, right? And so space exploration came up in those two very different ways as people's rationale for climate change. And so, again, I'm still working through analysis on this. This will be a book, hopefully. And so there's some things that I'm considering and thinking through. So in general, I see that Black boomers recognize climate change as an important issue, right? But not the biggest local environmental problem or voting issues, especially when I talked about voting in the minorities. A lot of individuals talk about some of the issues or problems that were more immediate for them, right, for this generation. So things like healthcare, things like Social Security, things like violence, things like the economy and education. Although they consider climate change an issue, it just wasn't a pressing concern. And we see that sort of thing when apparent when we think about environmentalism as an area of scholarship, but also an area for activism. Right, there's this sentiment that maybe certain communities don't care about the environment, and they absolutely do. There's just, I have to feed my family also. Like I'm trying to make ends meet. I'm working day to day. There's other economic constraints, structural constraints that make it such that I can't join the, the march for lower carbon emissions, right? And so that came up. Another thing that I'm thinking about is the role of religious beliefs in climate change attitudes and engagement for individuals. Again, I mentioned that many people, because this is a more religious example, right, in the Bible Belt and they're an older generation, they talked about the inevitability of climate change. Not because humans won't stop, burning fossil fuels, but because it's God's will. Like, anything that happens on Earth and in my life and in general is God's will. So if God is willing the planet to burn up or these disasters to keep happening, what can we as humans do about it, right? And so in some ways, religion became a barrier to thinking about the possibilities for climate change solutions. And so I'm trying to think through that. And one of the ways that I'm thinking of, in terms of on the other end, thinking about climate knowledge and re-entering neighborhoods and communities and kind of changing the framing of climate change. And one of those things that I think about having folks think about climate change more as a local issue than a global issue, right? If you localize it and not make it about the entire Earth, which is God, which is, he's got the song goes, he's got the whole world in his hands, right? If you make it local about communities and maybe tie it to economics, right? There may be a difference in how people view climate change and the solutions and mitigation around climate change. Another thing I was thinking about in terms of religious beliefs is the other side of Christianity in general, and specifically, as it relates to climate change. Although in the Bible, there's a lot about God's retribution and, the book of Revelations and what's to come, that in some ways mirrors like the natural disasters and the extreme heat that we see. But there's another part about humankind being the shepherds of the earth, right? Who are tasked with taking care of the earth and ensuring its prosperity, right? And so maybe thinking about religion as well as climate change as a way to empower Christianity in general, to empower individuals to take ownership of the earth, right? Have some sort of foster an environmental responsibility, so that they believe that the earth is theirs to take care of, as designed by God. Might be another way to rethink how religion plays a role in climate change. Lastly, well, not lastly, so another thing that came up was this idea of ecological grief, right? And so if you usually see this term as it relates to extreme weather or natural disasters that completely destroy communities and neighborhoods, and as a result, residents of those neighborhoods are left like grieving what once was in terms of their communities and their neighborhoods, right? And for New Orleans specifically, I saw those things come up, also intersecting with disaster capitalism, right? And another type of ecological grief that I saw, which was after Hurricane Katrina, which was, I'm like, at least a decade out. I was in like ninth grade, so I'm not old, but it was a while ago. We're so many years out from Katrina, but the city is still rebuilt. And the communities that were the Black communities, the low-income communities that were devastated by Katrina, some have not. Those neighborhoods don't exist the same. Right? Disaster capitalism happened and folks came in, folks with the money and folks with the money and the means to come in, tear down what has actually been destroyed and rebuild condos and higher housing that's unaffordable. That's happening. And so I heard from residents in New Orleans specifically, in Hollywood specifically, in Uptown, about the grief of like, this is not the neighborhood I grew up in, right? In terms of who's here, in terms of what it looks like they rebuilt and they left us out. Or I have family members who lived down the street after Katrina, they moved away, they were supposed to come back and never came back, right? And so that's sort of ecological grief. Lastly, but why is on the moon? I'm not familiar with the song or poem by Gil Scott Heron called Why Is on the Moon. And I feel like that might be the title of the book, we'll see. But I feel like that really captures the sentiments of this specific generation as it relates to the causes of climate change. Remember I mentioned that they talked a lot about feeling like space exploration was the source of, like in both ways, was the source of climate change. And if you've ever read that poem, Gil Scott Heron is talking about, my sister, I don't have anything to eat. My sister got bit by a rat. There's so much going on in the neighborhood, like, we're in poverty. This is like 1969, right? But we look on TV and Whitey's on the moon. Like those two extremes, how in the US, Black communities at that time, in 1969, were experiencing, still segregation, right? It was still segregation happening, poverty, disadvantage, racial inequality. But Whitey's on the moon, right? And we're supposed to be, I guess, it's a celebration, but also my immediate circumstances mean that I can't be that excited about Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin being on those are my names. All right, being on the moon, right? And so, I'm thinking through that, right? And again, these are baby boomers. So in 1969, they were teens, right? They were watching TV. They were youth. They were adolescents, right? And so, I'm thinking through that, and that may be why they go straight to that. Because for us, for younger generations, space exploration is like that's the thing. It's not not something new. We didn't watch it on TV we didn't watch it happen on TV for the first time. By the time I was born, space exploration was a thing, and it was like, it's like iPhones for a child being born there. They're like, yeah, I've seen it, right? So I'm thinking through that. So as I'm working on the analysis for this, I'm doing a similar study here in the Boston area, where I asked those 3 questions from the study of the South, but I also here asked about green space, right? Perceptions of green space for older Black adults, the quality of green space, and how they perceive green space as a means towards, better health, either mental health or physical health, and, how that might mitigate climate change. And along with that, how they view, in terms of government response, how they view the city, at the city and state level, whether or not, city leaders are effectively doing something toward, helping mitigate, climate change. And so that data has been collected, 50 individuals is the aim. I'm at 30, hoping to kind of segue, we're at time. Okay, hoping to segue back into, a more, qualitative and humanistic project. I have a Mellon proposal out, Mellon Foundation proposal out now to recontact the people that I've interviewed here and talk to their grandchildren and children, so millennials and Gen Z, and think about this one area of research on intergenerational conflict and solidarity as it relates to climate change, right? So there's a lot of talk on TikTok and on social media about baby boomers ruining the earth and the economy and Social Security, and they're leaving us, younger generations, with a mess, right? And so there's some conflict there, but also some solidarity and some needs where younger generations can give knowledge, but also receive knowledge from older generations as it relates to climate mitigation, climate resilience, and climate adaptation, right? And so it's supposed to be a documentary with like an actual face-to-face conversation with these grandparents and their children or their grandchildren. We'll see if that gets funded. We'll see if that gets funded. And then lastly, and some other future research in this area, I've received funding from the Army Corps of Engineers to examine Mississippi River communities. And again, we're thinking about climate change. If you live, I know people who live right on the bank. So here's her house, here's the road, here's the big bank, and on the other side of the Mississippi River, right? The Mississippi River is known, the last biggest flood was in the early 1900s, but if we think about climate change as, the impact of climate change is getting worse and worse, being a Mississippi River community is, it's pretty precarious. And so I'm going back down south again, and interviewing individuals outside of Memphis, Tennessee, a place called Waterproof, Louisiana, such a cute name, Tiptonville, Tennessee, and then Biloxi, Mississippi. And again, thinking about flood risk governance and community stakeholder experiences. And then the beginning of the title, and I'll end it here, is Having Its Own Way. I don't know if you know that quote by Mark Twain in his time down south in the Mississippi River. He says, the Mississippi River will always have its own way. No engineering skill can persuade it to do otherwise, which is kind of, again, thinking towards why the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers wants sociologists to talk to people who live along the river, who have the most risk in terms of what happens in the Mississippi with floods, but the Mississippi River might have its own way. None of this matters. So I look forward to your questions and your comments, and thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Satcher. We have time for questions. I have a quick question. So we used to have a colleague here who looked at the most green cities, sustainable cities. And if I remember correctly, Nashville was right at the top of like Nashville, Chattanooga, some of these towns in Tennessee. So I'm wondering, do you get any sense of differences in attitudes across these states? Maybe Nashville isn't considered as sustainable, but was there something that stood out about Nashville that might differ with, New Orleans, where it dealt with this major loss of an entire community?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when I hinted at the economic trajectories of these three cities is very different. And so Nashville is a growing city. I think when I lived there, the stat was 100 people moved to Nashville a day, right? And just in general, in terms of politics, although it's in Tennessee, which is one of those blue cities in a red state, so it's more progressive at the city level. And so in terms of enacting policies, even towards building more sustainable campuses like Vanderbilt, but also which is the largest urban forest in Nashville, the campus in like things like, bike lanes. So I definitely saw those things, and I think city leaders recognize that there's a lot of economic development and growth. And in order to sustain that, tying in or bringing in sustainable ways to make that happen, like green ways to make that happen, makes sense for that city, right? And so I think most recently they were looking to get a light rail in Nashville, right? So all of these ways, so for a city that's growing economically and has all the infrastructure, and funds to be able to institute green policies, whether it's based to infrastructure or other parts of transportation, I think that makes sense. For Jackson, Mississippi, and for New Orleans, Louisiana, it's a different situation. I think Mississippi in general, but Jackson as the capital city, has been experiencing population loss and economic decline since the 90s. And so the funds, even the way they're allocated funds relative to other cities in the state, right? Because it's a blue city in a red state, but that red is like green. It's a deep red, right? And so the funds aren't there, the infrastructure isn't there. The infrastructure should be completely overhauled, but it's not there. And then similarly for New Orleans, a purple city in a red state. In terms of economic growth and development, that might lead to the building of funds and capacity for sustainability. New Orleans is a city that's almost completely surrounded by water. So in terms of growth, you grow up, they build up, but you can't build out in New Orleans. And so experiencing some similar shifts in population, right? At least like your demographics of population. So very different from Nashville. Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I would like to follow up on a similar question. And so, sorry. So interesting to see all these factors playing together into the perceptions of climate change, like race, age, location. So I was wondering if there was any one particular factor, be it race or age or location, that drove the opinions or perceptions about climate change more than the others. For example, do you have any information about how the perceptions of Black baby boomers compared to non-Black baby boomers, or even within Black baby boomers, were there any differences between the South and some of the preliminary results we are getting in the North?
Oh, good question. Okay, so I'll try to answer it in pieces. So in terms of what I think might be some differences across race for the baby boomer generation. So I've only studied Black baby boomers, but when giving this talk, I talk to other folks who do study older white adults, like in Appalachia, on these same sorts of ideas around climate change. In terms of religion, there's a function around, white older Southerners tend to be evangelical, rather than Baptist. And so that lends to thinking about like having more of like a feeling of ownership of the land and of the earth. And so that ties to like we're shepherds of the earth. And so we should take care of it. However, I think across both races, economics matters, right? Other constraints that don't lend itself to having that much capacity towards thinking about climate change as an issue when there's so many other pressing issues, right? Again, especially for the generation, especially across, like if it was just low-income communities across race. So that's what I would think would be some similarities and differences. Within race, across these two parts of the US. So funny enough, I'm still getting sentiments around space exploration, right? And so I feel like that's just a generation. Maybe particularly for Black adults. But like time and space exploration is like this thing that's not, not good. I think in terms of some of the other things, of course, place shapes how they talk about the perception of climate change across their lifetime. So in Jackson, Mississippi, no one talks about the big snowstorm of 1972 because it doesn't snow. In Jackson, they talk about the heat, and they talk about flooding, but here in Boston, I think something happened in 1978, it was a really bad blizzard, and then maybe something else in 2013. And so people talk about that and how, especially for 78, because they were like kids, I think, some of them. Or like young adults, and they talk about how they were snowed in for days, and how they haven't seen anything like that, or nowhere near that much amount of snow for years and years and years, right? Similarly for Nashville, and it actually snows in Nashville. People don't know that, but, higher elevation, but, people talk about the blizzard of, I forget which year, but there was also a major flood with the entire downtown near Broadway, the Cumberland River flood, right? So that's in their environment, that's in their like collective memory of environmental issues. So there were those differences that were rooted like, in actual place, and like the weather and the extreme weather events that happened in place. And then of course in New Orleans, everyone talks about Katrina, but before that, I think it was Bertha, it was Hurricane Bertha, I believe. A lot of folks talked about, and then now New Orleans is getting tornadoes, and they never get tornadoes, they get hurricanes. And so folks have talked about seeing more tornadoes than they've ever seen as they were children or adolescents or even
Thanks. Yeah, thank you so much. So just following up on that, I was interested as you were sort of talking about the fascinating sort of field related in terms of parallels with international sort of views. So I'm thinking of parallels with maybe parts of the global south. There are a lot of factors that you sort of described as sort of in terms of shaping perception of climate change. I was wondering if that's something that's part of something that you considered or thought about or read about, because you know if you look at it from a slightly different lens, maybe lens of sort of privilege or you know how people sort of feel connected to this particular challenge. Yeah, if you could speak maybe a little bit to those parallels, if there's anything there.
So I think, okay, so first just in general, around how international and environmental, international cases of extreme weather have kind of impacted what folks are saying. It's all of this is so temporal also. At one point I was interviewing individuals, and it was right around the time when there was the heat wave in Europe, and like buildings were melting or whatever was happening in well, not melting, but like there was a heat wave in Europe last summer or the summer before. And so when people talk about, when I ask people about climate change in general, or like tell me what you know about climate change, they cited those things, right? They're watching on the news, they're seeing news media talk about climate change and this extreme heat, or they talked about the wildfires in California. So there's that, right? How like international news stories impact how they think about climate change. But also when I asked them, do you think everyone in the world will be impacted by extreme weather and climate change in the same way? Most folks say no. And so they talk about, they don't say the global south, but they talk about other countries with less like economic means, or countries that are already just based on their location or proximity to the equator, more hot or more cold, and how they might be experiencing these issues at an extreme level relative to even theirs. So that came up in that, I think when they thought about them as Americans and the issues related to extreme weather here relative to other countries that they don't have the same like economic infrastructure, even though ours failed us. But you know, yeah, so that was a period.
Is this on? Okay. I love this. Thank you so much. I'm really struck by this thing about space exploration. It's not something I've heard about before. And I'm curious, like, is that definitely a Black baby boomer thing, or it might younger generations also have this as a theme? I don't know whether equivalent ethnographies have been done with younger generations. And I'm also wondering, like, I mean, yeah, like moon landing, formative years, but it's also been almost 55 years. So I'm wondering if there might be other events that they might have alluded to in the interviews that shaped how they think about this. Like, I mean, the conversation of space has changed in those intervening decades, and I just like I want to hear more because it's such a compelling thing.
So, in terms of other events, aside from like so they speak more specifically about space exploration. They don't speak about other events, surrounding space exploration, but I do recognize it's been like years since then, but I do think, I'm trying to give an example of my time. I remember when I got an iPhone and my stepdad, I was showing my mom who's Gen X and my stepdad who's a baby boomer, that you could touch a screen on a phone. And it blew their mind. And for me, it was like, yeah, well, of course, but just, it makes sense. We were just flipping the phones up and now we can touch it, right? I feel like even though it's been 50 years for that generation, I can imagine being a kid, never seeing anyone leave Earth, and then seeing people leave Earth and step on the moon, right? I feel like 50 years out, that's still something that sticks in my mind. That can impact how I view something like climate change permanently. I don't know that younger generations think about space exploration like that. For them, it's like, yeah, we were doing it way before I was born, and now we're still doing it. I don't know that it sticks out to them in the same way. So I feel like it is maybe it definitely is a generational thing for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks a lot for this. I thoroughly enjoyed this presentation. I have a lot of questions, but let me just start with two that are kind of related. You already started to touch on my folks' questions. The first is, I'm curious about, or what I'm hearing is that in the few cases where folks did just believe that climate change was God will or some natural occurrence, I'm hearing like a passive dismissal of the problem, and I'm not hearing an active ideological denial of climate change. And I'm curious if that's accurate, or if you did run into some cases where there did seem to be a more active and hostile denial that climate change was real.
Not at all. I don't think once an individual would speak about climate change, speak about that in terms of denying that it happens. I think they were saying it's happening, we know it, and I believe it. But there's nothing we can do about it. Like, this is God's will, and I think that sentiment. And so for the sample, the folks I talked to, it wasn't like it wasn't dismissive of climate change as an issue, or even it was more like the way that I feel like culturally Black Southerners who are religious think about things that are stuck. Right, if I'm watching the news and they're saying, or if this research is telling me that, they say by 2050, that these extreme weather events will continue to happen, that's stressful, right? That's a source of stress for me, not only for myself and my health, but for future generations. It's a common theme for Black Southerners in general, and maybe Black Americans more broadly. When things get stressful and I can't control it, I gotta give it to God, right? It's not for me I can't sit 73, I'm just trying to make that day. I can't stress myself out about climate change, right? And so that I have to give it to God, right? And so God will handle it. Either it will find solutions or we won't. God, I even heard like, well, God will make it so scientists figure it out, right? But it's still up to God and not, me as an individual, there's not much I can do about it. And stressing about it and worrying won't do me any good. Or anybody else, honestly.
My second and last question for now is on exactly that. And so, do you see any difference have you or will you in your research see any difference in people's response to their agency in climate change based on things like if they were directly impacted by climate fueled natural disaster, or if they are already engaged in some political activity? Has there yet been any analysis, or will there be, to see if that tracks to more feelings of greater agency rather than that passive or someone can figure this out?
I think, which I think it lends itself to the regional differences. Based on the interviews here, I saw more of that, like agency and like thoughts and feelings around like activism and working. Like some of the individuals I interviewed here, like work with organizations, so the sample came from mostly Roxbury, and they historically work in Boston around social justice issues, right? They work with the NAACP around environmental issues that impact the here, it's so definitely that sentiment. But I think that's what, and so this sample of North was also much less religious. Most people said they weren't religious at all. Relative to folks down south who were like, yes, I'm religious, I'm a Christian, I'm a Baptist, and I go to church every Sunday, right? And so, that was apparent, for the Black Boston Center, for sure.
Hi, first, thank you for the great presentation, it was very enlightening. From my perspective, I'm a white Northern baby boomer, so it's interesting to hear the other perspective, but and we can relate to certain lives. Growing up, the moon landing was a very major impact on our lives, for sure, and I was very excited about that. It wasn't until a couple of years later that I heard Jill Scott Cameron's waiting on the moon, and being like, there's a different perspective here. But he wasn't doing it in terms of climate change, he was doing it in terms of economic opportunities, or inopportunities. And you know, that whole song kind of opened my mind to that prospect. But now, climate change is real. And that's, you know, and the science within that, a lot of it's caused by burning of fossil fuels. So how do you deal with these people who say it is God's will and just, you know, sort of qualifying your question in a way, and not accepting the fact that the science of it is, of course, with the burning of fossil fuels? How do you combat that, to combat climate change itself?
So me personally, it's one of the, so me personally, when they give their ideas about it, honestly, for me, it's not necessarily up for me to like agree to disagree. I'm just there documenting their experiences in their life, and so I never like, oh well, you sure? No, I'm just like, oh, great, you know. And also even with, that's one of those arguments that you can't, like, I don't have a counterpoint. I can't say, no, actually, you know, God isn't real. Like, I don't, like, who knows that for sure? That's one of those things where no one knows. Right? So it's not for me to disagree in first place, right? But it's also not for me to like say what they're saying isn't what it is. Because you know, only people who aren't living anymore know the answer to that, right? About like the afterlife and like a higher being, right? So that's usually what I think about it. But in terms of religion as either a barrier or a barrier towards climate action or something that might help facilitate climate action, I think that element is there. And I think, again, localizing climate change issues, making it about economics, thinking about like, you know, talking to people about like if you adapt, if you buy into this you know, solar, or you know, using these sort of appliances instead of the appliances, they're like giving them a voucher to be able to get different appliances. I think that's the way to do it, right? Tying it to economics, and their well-being, and making it local rather than making it global. And then again, so there are a lot of Black religious leaders who work in Boston, who work in terms of like work towards climate activism and climate justice, right? With that same, using the same book that these folks are reading, right? But thinking about, we're shepherds of the earth, right? We gotta take care of the earth for God, because God told us to do it, right? And when all said and done, and you know, I haven't been to church in a long time, so I'm trying to quote, you know, when we inherit the earth, right? The earth needs to still be here and it needs to look good. So we need to take care of it until Jesus comes back and y'all live on earth in the gardens and eating fruits and vegetables. You know, so all of that, right? And so religion and climate activism there's already connections there in the Black community. I think less so in the South, but much, like very much so in in Boston, in Black communities. And I would guess in other Northern or Midwestern Black communities and cities. So it's there, just not as much now.
Thank you so much. This is so interesting, and I'm really excited to be able to hear what you're working on. I'm struck, you mentioned how climate is so temporal, and I'm really struck by this idea And in response to some of the questions about thinking about the future, it sounds like a theme you're kind of finding is that kind of like give it up to God. But when I'm thinking about myself in the future, I'm not necessarily kind of grounding that in any way, or grounding that in the way around religion, but I'm curious in your work, when people were talking about climate and their perceptions of climate, was there any theme around like future generations? Was there any discussion of like what this means for my kids or my grandkids? Just kind of curious to hear a little bit more, thinking about how future is kind of played out here and how people are connecting it to future generations, if at all. It's totally possible that answer is no.
No, so yeah, they absolutely did. I think, so people, people love to talk about their grandchildren. If you have grandchildren, you love to talk about, it, right? And so I kind of frame the question as, so you have grandchildren, yes, you do, okay. What do they call you? Okay, they call you Momo. Okay, so if your grandchild came and said, Momo, tell me about climate change, what would you say? A lot of their responses outside of like, I don't know, go ask your mama, were like things like, well, baby, the world is very different than when I grew up, right? When I grew up, we had this, and it snowed on Christmas. And, we were able to play outside, we were able to leave our windows open at night in the summertime because it was cool enough. We needed air conditioner, and now that you're, in these days where you're a child, things are just very different and it might be worse. So that was there. But then also, when I think about like, at what point will it get like disaster movie, sci-fi, like at one point will it be like a global disaster like you see like in a movie? Some of them said, hopefully I'm gone by then. Other folks did talk about like worry about their grandchildren and children and like, I don't know what they're gonna do. And hopefully, I may be gone by then, but hopefully scientists, figure something out. Most of them did believe, because I asked them, like, do you think that scientists really know what they're talking about? Most of them say yes, right? So they do believe that science is factual and can be helpful. So yeah, there was some sentiments around like worrying about the future, and I'm hoping that the intergenerational stuff that I do will get more of that as well.
Hi, so this is the question from an online participant. If climate injustice is related to systemic, economic, and health inequalities from capitalism, would you offer your audience an opportunity to suggest a new economic system that they believe would benefit their needs?
We said the question. Was that the question? I think it was the question to the audience.
The question is, so the question is from the online participant.
Right.
For you. So they ask, would you offer your audience an opportunity to suggest a new economic system that they believe would benefit their needs?
All right,
So I guess the audience would be like your interviewees.
Yeah. Okay. So I am a person who is not a huge fan of capitalism, right? In general, right? And we can talk about how it relates to most, if not all, inequality and injustice, not only in the US, but just across the world, right? Capitalism. Not cool. So other systems that are not rooted in consumption, right? When we think about climate change and things like fast fashion and cars and a new iPhone, a smartphone coming out, which uses uranium, which is we get it from child labor. So it's all related, right? And so an alternative to capitalism would make sense, and I feel like would help mitigate all of the trickle down effects we see, not only as related to climate justice, but other areas of environmental justice and social justice and inequality more broadly, right? I think a political and economic system that centers on, community and only using what you need and not, less of a need for corporations, right? And think of labor differently, right? And the exploitation of labor very differently, I think, is an alternative. Now, I don't know what name we're gonna put on that, right? There's a few that might fit that, way of thinking, but, I definitely think that an alternative to capitalism would be, a step forward towards, thinking about solutions to our current circumstances in terms of the climate.